Hi, this is Mohammed Khan, and you're watching my vlog, the Unemployed GM Podcast Network. It's still not a podcast, still not a network, but it's something that I am working on, and hopefully over time, that's something that we're going to develop this into. Big news, obviously, coming out of Pakistan today. For those who follow Pakistan cricket, I believe Cricket Pakistan broke this news earlier today that Rehan ul Haq is going to be Pakistan's team manager, and Hassan Chima is going to be the head of analytics or analytics manager, however you want to phrase it. This is a huge development, not only for Pakistan cricket, but cricket in general. Um, Cricket, for the better part of its history, for all of its history, has relied on the input of former cricketers in positions of selection and positions of management and positions of coaching. The world has moved away from that model as people have gotten smarter. Ownership groups have gotten smarter. Specifically, the privatization of cricket has helped this. Um, Better people have been hired. There's been more merit in sport, right? So, in Major League Baseball, probably the most analytics driven sport of all the sports. Of the 30 general managers, 28 of them are are non come from non-traditional backgrounds, right? Only two former players are general managers of baseball teams. Which is the cricket equivalent of being a selector. These guys are paid, and women as well, are paid millions of dollars. They work 16 hours a day, 18 hours a day. Uh, they are critical thinkers. They understand data. They understand decision making. They understand process. Um, the NBA basketball is also very similar. Of the 30 teams in the NBA, 27 teams have general managers that come from non-traditional backgrounds, never played the game, or play the game at a very low level, high school, maybe college. And these people have come into the game, and they've really revolutionized the way that the game is played, the way that teams are built, the way that we think about the game. Cricket, and before I get to cricket, let me go back. European football, the same thing is happening, right? You're seeing a lot of really, different people come in from different backgrounds. Manchester City is doing this. Other clubs are doing this. Liverpool has done this. One of the reasons for their success. Um, this was going to happen in cricket. So, just to take you back on my journey, in 2015, I became the general manager of the Jamaica Talawas. I was coming right out of MBA school. Loved cricket, loved sports. I got the opportunity to do that job. Never played cricket at a high level. Played club cricket in the U.S., which is not even that competitive. Wasn't even that good. I would play recreationally, but I wasn't that good, obviously. But not only was I able to do that job, I was able to handle players, manage players, develop a hiring process for our coaching staff, and other staff members. I was also able to evaluate talent, develop it, and help drive the organization from my position. Certainly, I was not the only one responsible for our success. Um, the third thing that I want to talk about is the PCB, and Mickey Arthur deserve a lot of credit for this, right? It was going to take a really bold step. It was going to take a chairman. It was going to take somebody to really put their foot down and do this. It's surprising that it's Pakistan cricket, right? Because the PCB, of all the cricket organizations around the world, you can say the PCB is probably the most traditionalist, very politically driven. So it's a really, no one would, bet on the fact that the PCB would be driving this conversation, but nonetheless, the PCB has. Obviously, Mickey Arthur is involved in this process. He deserves a ton of credit for doing this. This is changing the game of cricket, right? And cricket is not going to be the same ever again. Um, and this is going to be the future. You're going to see other cricket boards do this. You're going to see more franchises do this, uh, as more and more people come into this field. The last person that deserves a lot of credit is Ali Naqvi. Ali Naqvi, of all the PSL franchise owners, comes probably from the most, um, in my opinion, probably comes from the best background, the best business background, of all the franchise owners. Comes from outside of Pakistan, where he's worked in a highly sophisticated, corporate finance environment, leading organizations, big banks, um, and that is that coincides with what we see in America, right? What we saw in America was private equity groups buying out NBA teams, Major League Baseball teams, and then putting in people that come from non-traditional backgrounds in positions of authority, because they believe that the traditional way of doing things was devoid of process, was devoid of rules, was devoid of data. And it was really important. And again, it took someone like an Ali Naqvi to see that, hey, there was these guys, Hassan Chima, Rehan Al Haq, they understand the game. Maybe they never played, but they have a good eye for talent. And it's more than that, right? It's not even just an eye for talent. Obviously, Islamabad is known for having this kind of data driven process in place, and they've been very successful with that. So I want to talk a little bit about Islamabad's success. Obviously, they won two PSL titles in 8 years, but I think what those two titles are the effect of a lot of good work. I think it's really important to focus on the work. Um, and so, number one, if you look at all of the PSL teams, the one franchise that's developed the most players, if you look at the nucleus of the Pakistan team, or many of the players that have come into the Pakistan team, they've come via um, Islamabad. Guys like Fahim Ashraf, Mohammad Wasim. Well, actually, Mohammad Wasim, I think, played for Pakistan before he came to IU, but Asif Ali, Hussein Talat, these are guys that really benefited from coming into the Islamabad system. When you think about guys like Fahim or even Asif, where specifically Asif is heavily criticized at Pakistan level, where maybe we haven't seen the same results that we've seen in Islamabad, it's because Islamabad's environment, Islamabad's team, is built to actually really magnify the skills that someone like an Asif Ali brings along. And I think that credit goes to Islamabad, right? So the reason that Pakistan was not able to unlock Asif Ali to that extent is that the Pakistan team is not built. Uh, the Pakistan team is built in a way that is heavily reliant on what Asif does. Azam Khan is another one where Azam was developed in Quetta, started showing a lot of ability there, but he really exploded this season with Islamabad. And it's because of the style of play that Islamabad plays, because of the culture that they've developed. And let's just talk about that a little bit, right? Because if you talk about style of play. If you look at all the teams around the world, Islamabad is going to be one of the teams that you find that has a distinct style of play, very batting centric, very aggressive. From the first ball to the last ball, you can disagree with it. I personally disagree with it. I think that although I believe in that style of cricket, I think that you need to have a semblance of balance to have the kind of sustainable success um, that they should have had, right? I think they probably should have won a little bit more, keeping in mind some of the talent that they've had. Obviously, there's mitigating circumstances, and winning is really, really difficult, right? One of the things that people ignore is that because they haven't experienced it, is how hard winning is. And obviously, you can critique that, but one of the things that Islamabad deserves a lot of credit for is that they've developed an identity for their franchise. And it's actually helped Pakistan cricket, right? So Pakistan cricket now has guys like Azam, guys like Fahim, guys like Asif, partly because obviously of their own efforts and own skills, and stuff the PCB has done as well, right? Because some of these guys are products of the PCB's grassroots program, but they've really grown in the Islamabad environment. So I think Rehan and Hassan and obviously Ali Naqvi deserve a lot of credit for that. Culture. Culture is kind of the big buzzword in sports, and it has been around for a long time. You read the All Blacks book that was published a couple years ago, and how important culture is, and a lot of the great leaders in professional sports will talk about it. Establishing a culture is really important. If you look at Islamabad's culture, at least from the outside looking in, the vibe, the environment, at least just from the outside, without having any knowledge of what happens on the inside. Um, is a really positive culture, right? It's a culture of growth and development. Players seem happy, support staff seem happy. There's a lot of smiles, and I think some we've seen a lot of that kind of transfer over to Pakistan cricket as well, right? And I think two other players that come to mind, obviously Hassan Ali recently joined Islamabad 2 years ago, I think, but Shadab has been there from the beginning. So Shadab, you can't talk about Islamabad's rise without talking about Shadab. And obviously, I missed out on that a little earlier when I was talking about Mohammad Wasim, Ashraf, Fahim Ashraf, and Asif Ali. But it goes without saying that Shadab has been probably the poster boy for Islamabad success. arguably one of the best all-rounders in T20 cricket in the world, came to Islamabad at a very young age. So a lot of his success, a lot of his rise as a player, as a leader, comes from that Islamabad environment. The other thing that agree with it or disagree with it, the discourse around data from a Pakistan perspective has been driven by both Rehan and Hassan, right? And a lot of people like to use that as a mechanism for hate, and enjoy the fact when Islamabad loses, that hey, data didn't work, or your execution sucked, or it's not about data. All this stuff that you like to hear. And obviously, there's always going to be a ton of haters out there, and that's fine. But bringing that into the mainstream discourse, very much, they're a big part of that. They're a big part of that. And I think the reality is that if you are not using data, and if you're not using data correctly, you're doing it wrong. It's very simple, right? There's nothing more to be said about that. If you look at Multan's success in PSL as well, a lot of that has to do with the appropriate use of data, right? It's not just about using data, it's about using data correctly. It's about understanding the numbers correctly. It's about developing the right process around it. The last thing that I want to talk about on the success side is the people that they've had to work with. No one's going to talk about this. It's not popular, but it needs to be said. If you look at Islamabad, they've worked with Wasim Akram, obviously a legend of the game. Bukhari Yunus, a legend of the game. I wouldn't put Misbah in the legend category, but obviously Misbah has had a great career. All of them at different times have technically been above both Hassan and Rehan in the food chain. And we've seen what they've done when they've gone out on their own, right? Bukhari Yunus, his merits as a bowling coach or as a decision maker within a group is highly suspect. His management approach, highly suspect. Similar, with Wasim, when we've seen him with Multan, when we've seen him with Karachi, for example, we've seen his team struggle without maybe that support that guys like Hassan and Rehan were bringing to the table. And the same with Misbah, right? Misbah, the reality is that Misbah really struggled as a selector. People will point to some of the successes that he had, but winning is actually important, right? So you have to be able to win. You have to be able to win to kind of cement your legacy. And so where Misbah made a lot of really good decisions, I think Misbah does have a decent eye for talent. His actually management execution of the entire process is suspect, right? Even when he was coach of Pakistan and he coached Islamabad simultaneously, I think Islamabad was really poor that year. And so, what is the enduring? What is the enduring or the common denominator in Islamabad? It's Hassan, it's Ali Naqvi, it's Rehan Ulhaq, and obviously, this is really good for Pakistan cricket. Now, not everything is good, right? I think it's important to where we talk about the good things, we have to talk about the drawbacks as well, right? So while I think that Rehan and Hassan are probably the right people for these jobs, I think these job descriptions and the operating environment around these jobs is quite dubious. The reality is that Rehan and Hassan are really good culture drivers. I see no reason why that shouldn't continue with the Pakistan team. What I would worry about is that there is a sense, could be completely untrue, but there is a sense, based on what was happening since the new management team has come in, that there is a kind of a divide and conquer strategy, and nothing has come from the PCB. But if you look at some of the topics of conversation that have come up in the media, some of the questions that were asked to Sarfraz, for example, when Sarfraz had success in the recently concluded series against New Zealand, some of the questions that were asked, some of the questions that were asked of Babar, some of the questions that were asked of Shaheen, of Shadab, the conversation that Shadab might be removed as vice captain, all of these things go against culture, right? This is kind of putting in a culture of toxicity where it didn't need to be, right? Because I think if you look at the history of Pakistan cricket, this is probably one of the more united Pakistan teams. That there is a sense that character is important when when you're participating in selection. And so how those guys go about reconciling that is going to be interesting. And I think that I think they're kind of being put in a position to not succeed, right? And so I would be very wary of that. The other thing is the people that are within this group, right? So I think all of the people here are quite smart, right? Obviously Mickey is smart. Mickey's had a long career in cricket management as a coach in different roles. Grant Bradburn, the same thing. Andrew Puttock is an interesting hire as well. Morning Morkel, I believe, has been hired as well, and I think I did a blog on this on Morning Morkel's hiring as a bowling coach. So I think the names are really good. Harun Rashid is the chairman of Selector, and of course, the PCB, the chairman has a huge role, right? The chairman, irrespective of his competency, whether it's Najam Sethi or Ramiz Raja, they're going to, go ahead, dive in headfirst into major decisions. And so while, again, I think it's a step forward, my fear is the execution part of this, right? Are these guys being put in a position to fail? What are their strengths? Their strengths are identifying talent, building teams, culture. Are they being put in a position to do that? That's a question mark, right? Obviously, Harun Rashid it goes without saying, he's not qualified probably to be the chairman of selectors for Pakistan. I think Mickey's record for Pakistan um, is quite dubious, in my opinion. I think if you look at, while Pakistan were amazing in T20 cricket and Mickey and Sarfraz, masterminded a lot of that. If you look at Pakistan's performances in Test cricket and one-day cricket, really weak. Pakistan were really bad in both those. I wouldn't say really bad, but they were poor. They were poor, right? You didn't see a lot of progress. You did see the development of certain players, but the other side of this is what those players have developed anyways, right? Guys like Babar, Babar is such a prodigy. Would he was on a natural growth trajectory, and I would say, right? The other side of it is, if not for Mickey's support, Babar would have probably been dropped early on in his Test career, and he probably wouldn't be the batsman today. And I think, I think that's a fair argument as well, right? So, that's one thing that I would say. The next thing I would say, and I'll bring in my kind of own experience. When I was given, or when I was empowered with the Jamaica Talawas, which was my first job, I had a lot more success. I was allowed to kind of stamp my vision, my authority on the team, on the franchise, and I got pushback. There are certain things that I had to conform to, but generally, I would say that for the most part, I did the things that I wanted to do while staying within the gamut of my job. When I went to St. Lucia, I made a lot of compromises. I conformed big time. Um, on coaches, on captaincy, on certain players that were in our team, and and I think that hurt our success. Excuse me, that hurt our success big time, and we struggled. Eventually, obviously, I resigned from that job, and so I would be very careful about this. There is kind of a reputational risk associated with going into this. Fans are going to be like, hey, they hired these guys, and you're not having success. Well, I think that when you have so many cooks in the kitchen, one of my big subjects is organizational structure, organizational functionality, and obviously this is every organization in the world, right? Fortune 500 companies, private companies, startups, whatever. Corporate governance, the way you operate is really important, so you can have the right people. But if they're not put in an environment, in a governance environment that kind of amplifies their skills, they can sometimes fail. And it brings me to kind of what we saw recently in the Pakistan series with Afghanistan, right? With Azam Khan, right? Where it's clear that Azam belongs in the T20 team. His batting talent is different, right? His level, the things that he brings to the table are superior to anyone else in Pakistan cricket at what he does, right? Um, what happened, right? There was a belief in him. There was an evaluation. Based on that evaluation, he was picked for the Pakistan team. He was then played as a wicketkeeper. He was played as a middle order batsman, as kind of he is with Islamabad. But the moment he failed, he was dropped. Now, let's say, for example, he was played in the third game, right? And he could have failed again. But there's also a possibility that he scores 20 runs off 10 deliveries. he scores 40 runs, 50 runs, 60 runs. And let's remember, Pakistan scored, I believe, 184 in that game. So it was a bit of a different pitch, a bit of a different vibe. And there was kind of an environment for someone like Azam to have success that day. Now, let's say that he did have success that day. That would change the calculus of how you think about Azam, right? Despite the fact that he didn't score in those first two games. So what does that tell you? That tells me that the PCB's process of evaluating talent is flawed. Their process for constructing a roster, for selecting a squad, is flawed. Their process for developing a player, integrating a player into a team, is generally flawed. The reason for dropping a player is inconsistent. And there's a sense that there's what I like to call data avoidance, right? Where now, because Azam has failed in those two games, the data suggests in those two games, very small sample size, that Azam's not good enough, that Azam doesn't fit, that Azam's not a good wicketkeeper. And based on that small sample size, you're going to make a decision, and no one's going to say anything about it, because how can you dispute those numbers, right? But that's one of the big problems with data in cricket, right? There's data manipulation from the management side. There's data avoidance. There's a misuse of data. There's an environment that's created sometimes that creates certain data that is inconsistent with what is actually happening. And so I always say this, and I'm going to say this until I die, that data without process, without rules, is still to a certain extent very valuable, but I would be more nuanced about how I think about data in cricket, right? Because management teams in cricket generally are not as competent as management teams in the NBA, in the NFL, and in European football, because all this is new, right? It's a manifestation of equity, privatization coming into cricket. So those are the things that guys like Hassan and Rahan are going to have to challenge. And I look forward to them doing that. And I think that them coming from non-traditional backgrounds is really important, because the people that are within the system are never going to challenge those things. Because for them, a lot of this is about survival. They're trying to survive. PCB is the only sporting organization in Pakistan that you can technically work in, and so there's a culture of survival within that, and you see that in Pakistan in general, right? The CSS culture, if you will. Hey, we need to secure this job. We need to keep this job. It doesn't matter what they make us do, right? Morals be damned, if you will. And so I think there's an element of that here, and I think that how you navigate that is really important. Now, I've been speaking to people within the PCB at different levels over the last 10 to 15 years, because this is the type of job that I've been trying to develop into cricket, and obviously I got my opportunity with in West Indies cricket in the CPL. It's finally happened, right? It's finally happened. It's finally happening, and this is a good thing. And I think it's important that someone comes from the outside, penetrates the system, and understands how you work within the system. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how these guys do. And I think that it goes without saying that this is an important moment for cricket. Cricket is being disrupted by this move. The PCB is essentially saying, intentionally or unintentionally, that hey, you don't necessarily have to hire a former coach, a former player to be a coach, or a former player to be a chief selector. That there's another way. And again, it's surprising that it's coming from Pakistan, but nevertheless, credit to the PCB. Obviously, credit to these guys for working incredibly hard, having success, and really being pioneers, right? Essentially, what they are, they're pioneers within Pakistan cricket. And I think it's interesting, right? I think one of the things that's interesting and it's worth talking about is Pakistan is probably one of the only cricket nations. I think it's actually the only cricket nation in the world that has people who come from non-traditional backgrounds and have been in a position of power, right? Obviously, Hassan Rahan with Islamabad, and now with Pakistan. We've seen Nabil come into Quetta, have a lot of success in Quetta, coming from a non-traditional background. I'm forgetting another name. Heather Azhar with Multan. Heather, initially when he came in, I think it was a different ownership group, but since ownership group change, and I think Alamgir Tareen is the owner, and briefly Ali Tareen was the owner as well. Heather's been a part of that success with Multan, right? And he comes from that non-traditional background, right? I believe that Heather's a lawyer. He's done a lot of work in the media. Uh, he's a part of that success, right? With Andy Flower, Nathan Lehman, and that entire group, Abdul Rahman, and that entire group comes from a non-traditional background, right? And obviously, I've never worked in for the PCB or Pakistan cricket. Obviously, I worked in the CPL, come from a non-traditional background. So it's a question that why is this happening, right? Why are people of Pakistani descent um, rising in cricket management, right? Obviously, I'm not working in cricket management now, but Heather, Kabir, and obviously Rehan and Hassan. I'm curious to know who these names are in other countries, right? In Australia and England, the West Indies, South Africa. I suspect that it hasn't happened there, right? Because as someone who follows the game quite religiously, I haven't seen it. So again, it's interesting to learn why that is and why that's happening. But nevertheless, I think it's a great day for Pakistan cricket. I'm eager to see what happens going forward, and hopefully this breaks the chains of hegemony, right, in cricket management. That you have to do one thing one way. The archaic structure of cricket, even the concept of selection, needs to end. We need to move towards team building, and we need to move towards some of the things that we are now seeing in cricket. So, thank you again for listening. Whoever listens to this, I hope this was valuable for you. And please share your comments and feedback. I think the chat is disconnecting. Well, anyways, thank you again, and I look forward to coming back and talking about something else that's interesting.